Hi, KRB teachers. Welcome to week 2 in the Maximinds Mental Health Care webinar series called Being Your Best Self. Today, we're looking at smart work versus hard work and how to help you to set personal boundaries. A reminder of the overview of the webinar series. And today, we are looking at the second part in the self module called Smart Work versus Hard Work. So starting with an introduction, what are we going to be learning about today? Ideally, my role is to help encourage you to first work efficiently and productively and then respond to external demands. What does today look like? Firstly, we're going to look at the balancing act of teaching. Then we'll look at working smart and then how can you work smart. Next, we'll look at hard work and when to actually work hard. Finally, we'll look at personal boundaries and how can you as teachers set personal boundaries in your work. A reminder, if you have not already done so, can you please scan the QR code and fill out a few questions to help gauge your understanding and also provide you with an opportunity to express some of the challenges that you're experiencing as teachers so that I can include these in the subsequent webinars. I'll just give you about 30 seconds to do so, please. Thank you for completing that. Now on to the balancing act of teaching. And you would probably be very acutely aware of this. You're constantly juggling many demands as teachers and wearing many hats. One way to look at the balancing act of teaching from a psychological perspective is that you have to look after your students, but also, which we're not necessarily as good at, is looking after yourself. The teaching really focuses on the former, which does ensure that you are looking after your students, particularly their education, but then you also get drawn into looking after their well-being, friendships and social circles, and also, of course, their networks, including their parents and guardians. The important thing to note here is, of course, that the other side is to look after yourself, because really you are only able to be the best teacher and the best version of yourself once you are able to look after things like your own development, looking after your own well-being, and also factoring in that, yes, you also have personal lives outside of teaching. So how are we going to start looking at how we can help navigate this? We'll start with looking at smart work. What is really smart work and working smart? Well, essentially, it's the strategic and efficient allocation of your time, effort, and resources to achieve results. It's you making thoughtful and intentional choices to enhance the efficiency and productivity. I would like you to please take a moment to think about what do you personally do to work smart as a teacher. So in light of that definition, just take a moment to think about how can you be and are currently efficient and productive in your work as a teacher. You may like to write down some things on that worksheet as well. Now I want to give you, from a research perspective, how do some teachers generally work smart? So firstly, repurposing resources. So that's really using what's already available to you, whether that be a teacher that's already previously completed it, option to use resources that you may have used yourself previously. So not necessarily just reinventing the wheel, but using what's already there and available to you. Being collaborative with peers in a similar train of thought. It's about actually drawing upon resources you've got available to you and working with your peers either at KRB and other colleagues and teachers, but also the teaching community more broadly. It's also about using technology and integrating tools that can help enhance your own efficiency, automate administrative tasks, and create more sometimes engaging and learning experiences. The key with technology, particularly, is of course there is a lot that you already have to manage and deal with, but the goal is to automate more of the administrative and data heavy tasks to technology. Also, time boxing. This has been found in the research to really help with optimizing productivity within certain time frames. So it's about giving yourself limited time to complete things, and knowing that you can only do realistically a certain amount of work or within a certain amount of minutes or hours. Outsourcing to students. So obviously obviously students have different levels of ability, and how can you help students, sorry, how can you help students to help one another, to also support one another, particularly those that perhaps more advanced, to help those that are less competent, and ensuring that those distinct learning types and abilities can be met without having necessarily to add to your own workload. And finally, automating communication. So I mentioned this could be via email, for instance, so in terms of technology, but also firstly working out how you'd like to be communicated with, and setting up, for instance, like a automatic response email to or whichever way you communicate, to go through and give students or fellow teachers or even parents a step-by-step process to communicate with you. And I'll show you more in a moment how that could look. So in terms of how to work smart, we've just covered some of these ideas, but just to remind you, it's really about using what you've already got, relying on things like technology to help take away some of that data and admin, limiting your own time to advance and make the most of your own time that's available. Why not? Engaging students more in the process to help you, and automating communication. As mentioned, I wanted to talk you through those last two in particular, which is outsourcing to students and automating communication. Something that I do when I'm teaching interns as part of my business and with Maximinds is I give them a very specific order in which to come to me with questions. So, for instance, it's encouraging students to firstly actually take initiative to try and problem solve themselves. That's obviously going to help them develop their own resilience and ability to problem solve, which is advantageous for them. Get them to then ask a friend for help. That's advantageous for not only the friend that can then actually explain things to them, because they can solidify their own understanding, but it also means that the student gets to learn from someone that speaks more their language, and they may not feel as comfortable, for instance, asking you for questions, and they can actually have permission to go to someone else. Call upon their buddy, and this is something, an optional system you could implement if they don't have necessarily friends, but how can you buddy up within the class? They can rely on each other to answer questions or problem solve. Also refer them to ask someone in a class above them or even a year above them. They've already gone through the process themselves. How can we leverage those inter level connections, which is also obviously advantageous from a social perspective? And then finally, and if all else fails, then come to you and ask you. So that's a way that not necessarily is trying to shift your workload out elsewhere, although that is the advantage. It actually also empowers not only your students, but also their peers and their fellow students, so that everyone wins, and it saves you those extra minutes that may be needed to give people and students particularly bespoke and one-on-one attention. So that's a way to work, for instance, smarter rather than just hard. What I would like you to do now is bring out your worksheet, and there is an option for you to please write how you may decide to work smarter. These may be things that you've already thought of before, but in addition, anything else you may have learnt, please write that down. Moving on to hard work, and we've covered this in the previous webinar, which is, of course, teachers have to work hard and there are a huge amount of demands upon you. Unfortunately, that is an inevitability, and there will be times, and we'll look at when this is required. So what is hard work? It's more dedicated and intense effort expended to fulfill your responsibilities as a teacher. It can involve demanding activities and commitment. I would like you to take a moment to think about what makes teaching difficult for you and what do you find particularly to be hard as part of the profession. According to the research, there are particular times when working hard is required for teachers. Dealing with emergencies and crises, of course. Sudden changes happen and you need to know what to do immediately, and it creates that sense of urgency to try and restore the stability. Keeping students safe. Again, unexpected challenges can occur which require that immediate and urgent attention. That can also include physical, but increasingly so, as we've discussed, more mental, as mental illness rises amongst students. Complying with law and ethics. There seems to be more and more compliance, reporting, educational policies, regulations, things that you have to do not only personally and ethically according to your own standards, but also that of being a teacher, but also, of course, that being those expected by KRB. Ensuring students are learning. We've talked about the differentiated levels of learning, and so, of course, adapting to sometimes the style that needs to happen to manage the different levels in your classrooms. Obviously, logistically and practically quite demanding and requires hard work, but also quite mentally draining. Further to that, managing classroom dynamics, and that may be with different levels, but also ensuring that you're demanding that authority and respect, but also dealing with other social and friendship issues and challenges, which of course come with teenage girls. And finally, marking, assessing, and reporting, and back to sort of that idea of the compliance, which is a very draining time, we know, around report season, but also marking assessments, particularly with those, with large classrooms. So when is the time to actually work hard? As we looked at these sorts of times, so in the crises and emergencies, when safety risk is there for legal and compliance reasons, when students' learning is suffering, for essentially the sake of classroom cohesion, and finally during the assessment and report periods. So now, if you wouldn't mind getting out your worksheet and writing down when you will work harder and when is required to expend that extra energy and effort. And finally, personal boundaries. So, given that need to sometimes work harder and have those more intense periods of concentration needed, effort on your behalf, how can you set personal boundaries? Firstly, what are they? They're limits, guidelines, and self defined parameters to maintain a healthy work life balance, to establish a sense of control over your own professional lives, and ultimately to protect your own well-being. You will see again there the establishing a sense of control, which we know is very empowering in terms of mental well-being. I would ask you to think about what personal boundaries do you currently set as a teacher? Just taking a moment to think about it. You can also write them down on that worksheet if you like. Some other ideas for you for personal boundaries. It's having personal and professional priorities, having them both individually, but knowing how they have to work together. Under promising and over delivering, So, for instance, saying, I can get something to you by the end of next week, but then potentially and ideally delivering it just before the end of next week, for instance. But the key thing is under promising to give yourself that extended period of time. Articulating clear conditions. So, yes, I can do this, but I'll need this, this, and this first. So, giving the blockers that you'll have to the person that's potentially asking something from you, whether that be a student or otherwise. Learning to say no. This is why we set priorities in the first place. Is it fulfilling your own priorities within reason? Appreciating there are things you have to do, but if it is beyond your capacity or competency, practice saying no. Teachers, because they are naturally giving, empathetic people, and you are always prioritizing students, actually practicing that ability to set that boundary and make conscious choices about where you allocate your time and energy. Creating physical and mental spaces, so really designating separate areas. Even if you are taking work home, how can you have specific areas to work at home which enable you to have more clear mental separation between the professional and personal concerns, which is an ongoing challenge, particularly heightened because of COVID. And finally, practicing self-care. Activities such as, whether it be exercise or hobbies that you have, but really scheduling those in and having time and allocating the time on the weekend, before or after school days, for instance, to ultimately prevent burnout. Just want to add here, there is a myth, of course, of boundary setting. It is not just about turning your cheek and rolling your eyes at the requests and expectations, although, of course, that may be tempting at some times. It's there are expected requirements and responsibilities that you do have as a professional. What it is really more about is helping you to balance your role as a teacher. So setting boundaries within reason where you can, provided you're already fulfilling those immediate responsibilities as a teacher. So it's that balance, balancing particularly your personal and also professional needs. So it's not just give, 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 it's also about give and take. So how to actually set personal boundaries. You may have already written some down, but a reminder, here are some other ones that you can think about. Actually defining your priorities. And is it the well-being, for instance, of your elderly parents, or is it making sure that a particular special needs child has that extra half an hour with you on a Thursday at lunchtime, whatever it is. So really listing and writing out together, both at home and at work. Under promise and over deliver, we've looked at clear conditions. So saying yes, if this happens. Learning to say no, creating those physical and mental separations and spaces, and practicing self-care, which we'll particularly look at next week. This is what it sounds like, and I have read some of these out to you already. So saying things like, sure, I can get this to you, even if you think it could be this week, say by the end of next week. Saying when someone wants to see you today, it has to be today, particularly parents, for instance, it's urgent. Yep, I'm but can make time next week or tomorrow. Unfortunately, I don't have the capacity to help you at the moment. That's that blanket no. And finally, yes, I can do X if you do Y, Z, or whatnot, or if this and this happens. So please, your worksheet to complete that final section and writing down how you will set personal boundaries. What did we learn about today? Hopefully that SMART work is the strategic allocation of time, effort, and resources to enhance productivity and efficiency. And this can be done by repurposing resources, collaborating with peers, using technology, time boxing, outsourcing to students, and automating communication. Hard work is the dedicated and intentional effort required to fulfill responsibilities that are typically demanding, such as when dealing with crises, keeping students safe, complying with laws, teaching students, maintaining cohesion and marking and reporting. Personal boundaries then are the limits that you can put in place. Guidelines, parameters, they can help you to maintain your own work-life balance and overall well-being. You can defining your priorities, under-promising, articulating those conditions, learning to say no, creating different spaces between work and home, and practicing self-care, something that we will be looking at in more depth next week. Resources, always available to you. Here are your emergency contacts. And of course, you have the option to log on to Maximinds, and there is 2024 for free access for you. As always, please do reach out with any questions, comments, things you like or don't like. Also to refer yourself and or a student, you can do all of that by scanning the QR code and going online. Dear teachers, look forward to seeing you again next week.